Starting a series today called The Seven Deadly Ones. And we're going to talk about a word that we often don't want to talk about. It's an S word, not that S word, or the other S word that you might be thinking of. We're talking about the word sin. And when we talk about the word sin, there is this immediate response that we all have. We feel uncomfortable. We begin to be almost worried because some of us at some point have sat in a place like this where the goal of the speaker was simply to cause guilt, to cause shame, to scare the hell out of people. And so we've come into this place, and when you hear that we're going to talk about the issue of sin, we begin to become worried. Understandably so. This is one of those words we've actually not used the word sin at times, right? We want to use error or mistake. We want to say screw up. We have issues. We have challenges. But we're really going to spend these next 7 weeks talking about sin. We all know that sin hasn't gone anywhere. We can look at the paper, whether it's in print or online. We can look at our Facebook feed. We can walk our communities. We know that something is not right. If you're here today and you would say, look, I don't know if I'm a follower of Jesus. I don't even know if God exists. All of us, I think, would agree that something is wrong. There's this brokenness, and many people want to explain it different ways, but ultimately, I think it comes back to sin. Sin is this voluntary violation of a known law of God. So to know what God wants for us and basically to say, no. I'm going to go my own way. I'm going to do my own thing. I'm going to think what I want to think no matter what God has to say about it. So we feel it. We know it. We understand that something has gone wrong. Now, part of the issue with sin is, well, what a sin is to you may not be a sin to me. I mean, who gets to decide what a sin is, and how do we decide what we do about it? But ultimately, we think that God's word to us, the Bible, the scriptures, defines what those things are. So bear with me. As we talk about this subject, don't give up on me. Don't make assumptions. Don't think I'm going to go somewhere that I may not be going. Walk through this with us for the next 7 weeks. This is going to be a little bit of a longer series that we're going to do. But would you commit to being here as we do this? And my goal is not only that we would just talk about sin differently, but ultimately, I think the better question that we need to ask is, what if we begin to see God differently? Not just should we see sin differently, but what if we begin to see God differently? Because when we talk about this, I really believe that the description of God being a good father is so vital to what we believe. To see him as a good father. That he wants us to experience life, that he wants us to have it abundantly. One of my favorite scriptures, and you probably hear me say it more than any other scripture when I speak to you, is John 10:10. I think this is one of those scriptures that we could memorize together, and I'm going to read it, and I'm going to ask you to read it along with me. If you don't own a Bible, there should be a red Bible around you somewhere. That's our gift to you. Please take that. We'd love for you to have that Bible. But I want you to read this with me, okay? This isn't what we normally do, and that's all right. But I want you to get a sense of what the author is trying to say here. So John 10:10 says this: "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Let's do it again. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. What if we believe this? What if we believe there is this enemy of God who is trying to keep you from experiencing life? Some of us have this view of God and his rules saying, well, he just doesn't want us to experience fun or happiness or joy. He just wants to control us. That's not true. What God wants for you is much bigger than you could ever imagine. What if he actually wants to protect you? What if he wants to help guide you in the direction that brings life to you and to the people around you? I realize this often, but I realized again this week that parenting is hard. I don't know if any of you ever get to that point where you've known being a parent is hard, and then you have one of those weeks and you're like, parenting is tough. It's hard because discipline is hard. To stick to your word is hard. To not say you're going to do something and then back out, but to actually follow through with it, to have consequences, is hard. It's hard. And so I have an 11-year-old that's almost 17, and a 6-year-old little boy, and they are both great kids, but you just have those weeks. And so there's those times where I know I need to put rules into place. If you're a parent, if you've had the opportunity to have kids, you know the reason you have rules. Like, I have this rule, it might sound crazy, but I have this rule in my house that my kids can't play in the street. I don't know if that's crazy or not, but I love my kids and I want them to be safe. And so I have this rule, like when the sidewalk starts and then you have that patch of grass, I tell them, don't go past the sidewalk. And this started as an early age, and there were consequences if they went. Right? How loving of a father would I be if I said, you know what? The street, you want to play there? Go ahead. You'll find out sooner or later that that's not best for you, right? But as a loving dad, what I want for my kids is to experience life. And so I have rules and I have ideas for them. Not to hinder them, not to keep them from something, but to give them something. And so I believe God is the same way. What if we could look at these few sins over the next couple weeks, and we begin to ask the difficult question and say, all right, well, what is God saying to me? What am I going to do about it? And how do I normally handle it? How do I normally respond when I think about the sin in my life? So I think first, before we can really deal with sin, we have to do that. We have to understand who God is a little better. And without a good picture of sin and how destructive it can be, then God's grace isn't amazing. Right? We sing these songs about God's forgiveness, about God's grace, but if we don't understand the destruction of sin, if we don't understand that there is the thief who wants to kill and to steal and to destroy, then we don't see the full goodness of God. And so we're gonna look at these things called the 7 deadly ones. We're gonna look at the 7 deadly sins. Now, just so you know, this isn't necessarily biblical. So the 7 deadly sins, you wouldn't find those necessarily listed out somewhere. Now there's a couple of lists of sins that there's a few people who kind of made a good list, we'll say, and saying our behaviors and our actions fall under these. And so you could look, if you want to jot this down to look at later, it's Galatians 5:19 through 21, Proverbs 6:16 through 19. And so around the 4th century, you have this monk who's trying to help people. And so he's trying to figure out the best way to do it. And so he kind of comes up with these 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. And said most of the things, our behaviors, fall underneath these. A little bit of a side note, as I was researching and looking at this stuff, TV and movies have used the 7 deadly sins a lot, and you didn't even know it. So I'm going to give you some things. Don't research it now. So use your phone later, right? Because you're going to want to look at this. And it's a rabbit hole. You'll go down and you won't be able to get out. But Gilligan's Island. Gilligan's Island, the characters, many people say, are associated with one of the 7 deadly sins. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Each of the characters from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, including Grandpa and Willy Wonka, are one of the 7 deadly sins. The characters from Friends are part of the 7 deadly sins. Winnie the Pooh, okay, could be coming back to the 7 deadly sins. They made a movie several years ago with Brad Pitt. I wouldn't necessarily suggest watching it, but they made a movie just called 7 that was based on the 7 deadly sins. And so I know later you're going to want to go back and you're going to want to look these up and who fits what. Just do it later, okay? You'll look up and I'll be done and you'll think, where did that time go? But look at that later. It's all around us. It's all around us. And so what if we were beginning to deal with them? What would that look like for our lives? So we're going to deal with what I think is one of the most deadliest. And when I say deadliest, I want you to understand something really clearly. I'm not saying that if you struggle with one of these, then you will physically die. What I think the original people were saying is these are dangerous. These don't lead to the life that God wants you to have. They're deadly in that sense. I want you to hear that there's grace upon grace upon grace for these sins that we're going to talk about. That God's goodness is way better and bigger than any of these sins that we're going to talk about. Now, you could probably defend every one of these and say, well, I think this one's the deadliest or the most dangerous. So I'm going to tell you what I think is the most dangerous and deadliest, and we're going to talk about that today, and that's the issue of the sin of sloth. The sin of sloth. Now, here's why I think it's one of the most dangerous. Now, when you think of sloth, you might think of this little animal that you would find at the zoo. Isn't he cute? Yeah. Like, oh, what's wrong with that? All right? I mean, a little sloth. And when we think of sloth, we just think of lazy. Right? You might be thinking, I love my Sunday afternoon naps. Please tell me that I can keep doing my Sunday afternoon naps. Don't take that away from me. I'm not talking about hitting snooze. Anyone else hit snooze over and over in the morning? My wife loves it when I do that in the mornings. I'm not talking about just purely laziness. When we think of sloth, that's often what we think of. But that's not true. What I think sloth really is looking at is not taking the opportunities that are put in front of us. It's not caring about our marriages if you're married. The issue of sloth is not really caring about anything. A better word for sloth is indifference. You hear about something going on, you hear about a need or a struggle, you think about your own relationship with God, and you're kind of like, That is the sin of sloth. And the reason I think that's dangerous is before we can talk about pride or greed or envy or anger or any of those, if you struggle with the sin of sloth, we'll talk about that and you'll be like, I don't think that really matters. And we become indifferent to those things. And so we have to understand from the beginning the sin of sloth. Another word that we could talk about is apathy. Just this lack of interest for what's going on, of not caring about the needs around us. And then spiritually, as we think about our relationship with God, it's this spiritual amnesia. President at a seminary up in Michigan, he wrote this. Spiritual amnesia is going through the motions, not attending to our relationship with God. When we're in that state, God does not seem very real to us, so we don't pray. The less we pray, the less real God seems to us. And the less real God seems to us, the duller our sense of responsibility becomes, and thus the duller our sense of ignoring God becomes. We just become a part of this cycle of indifference, of apathy, of not caring. And I think this is one of the most dangerous and deadly of all the sins. We end up not caring for the other. We could define that in lots of different ways. But the sin of sloth leads us to just not care about the other. It causes us to not care about the pain and suffering in our world, the injustice around us. We don't care about using our talents for good, the resources we have, the energy. We just don't really care about doing anything with that. And then ultimately, just our relationship with God. We come here and we check the box. We often talk about this. We check the box of, okay, I went to church on Sunday. I did a good thing. But other than that, is there any life to your relationship with God? Are you communicating on a fairly regular basis? Are you reading the Bible for yourself? Even if you're like, I don't know if I believe the Bible, just open it and read it. Just give it a shot. But many of us fall into this trap of just kind of being indifferent about our relationship with God. And the dangerous thing I think about sloth is the other ones, we can recognize it clearly. And often the other ones happen in a moment. But I think the sin of sloth, many of us will get to a point in our lives where we might look back and think, how did I get to this point? What decisions did I make where I got here where I just didn't care anymore? I didn't care about my marriage. I didn't care about my kids. I didn't care about my job. I'm just going through the motions. I was a student in Kansas City area. I was playing football, going to college, and at the time I was dating a girl in Wichita. And so any chance I had, I would make the drive to Wichita. And so I didn't have school on a Monday morning, so Sunday night I drive to Wichita and I spend the time with the girl I'm dating and her family. But I had football practice on Monday. And so in my head, I knew exactly when I needed to leave to get back for practice. And so Monday morning comes, and I spend every moment I can with her and her family, and then the time comes when I need to leave. And so I make the trip from Wichita to Kansas City. And about halfway, there's a point where you have to kind of veer to head up to Kansas City. Well, I didn't veer. And I continue to go north into what you think of when you think of Kansas, the nothingness of Kansas. And so I entered into the nothingness of Kansas. And about that time, I realized I also have no gas. And I've realized I've shared several stories where I've ran out of gas and understand that that's an issue for me. And I think I'm sitting on empty right now. So someone needs to follow me out of this place. But I run out of gas. I'm in flip-flops. And now I know for sure I'm going to be late for practice. If you've been an athlete, this is not something that you're excited about. And so finally someone picks me up. They put me in their car. I go and get gas. And then when I get to Kansas, and I change out into my football gear, and I walk out on the field, I make the dreaded walk out to the rest of my teammates who are already practicing. And there were consequences. And so that day, I had to do 100 yards of somersaults. So just somersault after somersault. That was the punishment that I had for that day. And I remember somewhere in the middle of feeling I'm going to throw up and being mad at myself, that I kind of asked this question, what happened? Right? It wasn't just one decision. With some of the other sins we're going to talk about, it might just be one decision that we can focus on. And that has caused us to struggle with lust or with greed or whatever it might be. I feel like sloth is this kind of slow death. It's this slow death that just kind of eats at us. It just eats at us. Proverbs 13:4, if you have a Bible, the Proverbs are these wise sayings that we think were written kind of to younger boys. This Proverbs 13:4. It says, the sluggard craves and gets nothing. The sluggard could be the sloth, the lazy. The sluggard craves and gets nothing, but the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. The sluggard or the lazy or the slothful craves. They want, they have these desire, they covet. But then in the end, they're just left feeling empty. They never get what they want. I think something happens to our hearts and our minds and our souls when we believe that there's someone or something that can play the role of God in our lives. Something happens in our heart, in our mind, in our soul. And I feel like what he's saying here is the sluggard, the one who isn't diligent, the one who just doesn't really care. They want a lot of stuff. They feel the void in their life, and they're trying to figure out what can fill that, but never being able to find it. And so if you're like me and you ever put something in the place of God, and you feel the emptiness of that, and you feel maybe the shame or the regret, the wish I wouldn't have done that, we then hide. Maybe we hide in relationship. We think we can hide from God. We grow tired and we grow weary. We become cynical. And then this is where I believe the sloth comes in. We become numb. We become callous. We feel empty. We have despair. We no longer care. We no longer try. We just feel indifferent to it. The sluggard, the slothful, wants and craves, but is left empty. We hit the point of indifference, and the sin of sloth sets in, and we crave and crave, but apathy leads to unfulfillment. But, he says, the desires of the diligent are fully satisfied. Those who are faithful, who work hard, who don't give up, who reject apathy, who care, are fully satisfied. The King James Version, so an older version, some of you maybe grew up reading this, it says it like this: the soul of the diligent is made fat. We get that comparison. The sluggard craves, it is empty and has nothing. But the one who is faithful, who is diligent, who cares, who takes the time to worry in a healthy way about the things of our lives, your soul becomes full, becomes fat, and you experience life. It leads to this full life, the abundant life, as we saw in John 10:10. So some of you maybe are in this first part. You're indifferent to your work. You show up and you clock in and you clock out, but you don't see it as a part of your purpose or your mission. We become indifferent and we have apathy towards our community. We see things that happen and we're just kind of like, doesn't necessarily affect me. I don't really care too much about that. We become apathetic to our struggles. You struggle long enough with something, you just begin to be numb to it. Until finally you just are indifferent towards it. Whether it's our marriage, family, our health, our relationship with God. I just want to be honest for a moment. With my men, with my guys, I think this is dangerous for us. I think the sin of sloth is a very dangerous thing for us as men. We think that if we're workaholics, that if we're busybodies, if we take care of our family, then we don't struggle with this. But as I said earlier, being a sloth isn't necessarily being lazy. It's this indifference. It's the apathy. So can I encourage you, men? This applies to women too, but men, fight for the things that are good. Fight for your family. Give your all to your work. See that as a place where God has put you, that you have purpose and you have mission there. And to fight and reject against apathy. So I think part of the cure of the sin of sloth in our lives is diligence. Obviously, God helps us. That the cure of our sin is Jesus. But Jesus will help us by being diligent, by being faithful. And so diligent cures slothfulness by placing the interest of others. Listen to this. Diligence cures slothfulness by placing the interest of others above a life of ease and relaxation. We care more about others than we care about ourselves and our own lives of ease. I want to look at something Jesus says, Matthew 25. I'm going to kind of summarize it for us. There's a master that is going on a trip, and so he leaves his servants what's called talents. It would have been around $1,000. It was an amount of money. And he leaves them these talents before he goes off, and he leaves certain amounts to each one, 5 talents, 2 talents, and 1 talent, and he leaves them with this expectation that they're going to do something with it. And so he comes back after a long trip, and he approaches the one with the 5, and the one with the 5 says, look, I put it to good work, and I've doubled it. I've doubled it. And the man with 2 talents, he also comes, and he says, look, you gave me 2. You had expectations for me with these 2, and I've gained 2 more. And verse 23, it says, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful. You have been diligent. With a few things, I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. Verse 24, it says, then the man who had received the 1 talent came. Master, he said, I knew that you're a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your talents in the ground. See, here's what belongs to you. This third one basically says, man, I was just kind of indifferent. I knew you were going to come and take what wasn't yours, so I just really didn't care. So I took it and I hid it. Here's back. Verse 26, his master replied, you wicked and lazy servant. Some translations even use the word slothful or sluggard. So you knew that I harvested where I have not sown and gathered where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. He then removes him from the kingdom. This is the seriousness I think Jesus is laying out here. The problem is not that he lost it. I often wonder how the story would have gone if it would have been that. If he would have come and he said, look, I tried. I thought I put it to good use, but I'm coming back to you with nothing. But the problem here is that he did nothing. It was his indifference here. It was his apathy. It was his not caring. It was his slothfulness. It was his laziness that causes the problem with Jesus. Okay, so I've talked to my men. If you're on the older end of life, can I just encourage you today? We need you. Our church needs you. Our communities need you. Our families need you. Our marriages need you. As parents, we need you. Your wisdom, your insight. We need you to walk alongside of us. So there's not a point, my young people, there's not a point where you all of a sudden get to be used by God. You have that opportunity now. You have gifts, you have talents. My teenagers who are here today, my junior hires, my high schoolers, you have been given something. And there is this expectation that you'll do something with it. But then on the other end, there's not a point where you're like, man, I put my time in. I'm going to go ahead and let someone else do it now. There's not a retiring from the mission of God. There's not a retiring from participating in what God is doing in his kingdom here on earth. He needs you. You are vital to the health of Trinity. You are vital to the health of our community. You are vital to the church. We need you. So just like I'm encouraging the men to reject apathy, I know there's this point sometimes as you get older just to become indifferent. And you've done such good work over time that you think now you'll just step away, but don't. But press in. We desperately need you. As you grow tired or weary, as you feel indifferent or apathetic, fight against that and reject it. If you were to go on and read, this is the part of the scriptures where Jesus talks about dividing the sheep and the goats. And in that teaching, it is also about inaction, what we do and we don't do. There is a seriousness to our indifference. Elie Wiesel, he was a Roman Jew. He's born in 1928. Some of you may recognize that name, and I may not be able to do it justice and say it right. But at the age of 15, he was a Romanian Jew, and him and his family are forced onto a train. They're forced into a cattle cart with about 80 people. And they make their way on the tracks into one of the deadliest concentration camps that there was. And arriving in this concentration camp, about 90% of the Jews would be immediately exterminated. And so if you have this 15-year-old boy who hears the train and is on the tracks, and he makes his way into Auschwitz. And when he gets there, they begin to divide the people, those who are fit and those who aren't. And so he lies and says he's older, and his father says he's younger, and they both get to go and work. But his mom and his sisters are taken away and taken into a death camp where they lose their lives. He survives the camp. He makes it the year, and he's finally liberated. And then he began to write books, and he began to speak. And in 1999, 54 years after finding himself free from this camp, he stood and delivered a speech, The Perils of Indifference, in the presence of President Bill Clinton and White House staff and a community on the television. He warned of the lure of this indifferent mindset. He explained that the temptation of inaction and apathy allows us to focus solely on our own desires and goals. That empathy and engagement with people is what makes us human. Oh, think about that. Empathy and engagement with people is what makes us human. And he showed that by embracing indifference, we would betray our humanity. That while in captivity, he and those he was with felt abandoned and forgotten. They believed that the world could not know of their suffering, or else some action would be taken. They felt the sting of indifference. And he said in his speech, and I quote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference." This man who felt alone and thought someone's got to know what's going on. If someone knew, they would come and rescue us. He lost family, and he saw numerous people lose their lives because of indifference, because of apathy. We see this today. We see indifference and we see apathy towards the least of these. We see apathy and indifference towards the refugees before the oppressed. And I've done a lot of reading and I've done a lot of study on Martin Luther King lately, and just his life and the difficulty of his life in his last years and what he was trying to stand for and how so many people were against him, and reading a lot about the civil rights movement. And I've come to the assumption that the lack of response of white Christians during the civil rights movement was deafening to our black brothers and sisters. I don't know if you know this, but even as the civil rights began to attempt to bring people together, the church wasn't. There was still a division in the church between black and white. There was this indifference. There was this apathy towards what was happening. Martin Luther King, one of his most famous quotes, he said, "In the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." The silence, the indifference, the apathy. The diligent life that we see in the Proverbs is this life that is full, it is satisfied, it is this vibrant partnership with God and what he is doing. Sloth is dangerous. It is deadly. The indifference, the apathy speaks volumes about what we believe or not believe. So God's desire for your life and for mine is so much more than what many of us are experiencing. The expectation to be good stewards of what God has given us, what he's put in our hands. What are we going to do with it? The classroom that you sit in every week is an opportunity. It is a resource. The office where you work business deals is an opportunity and a resource. The hard physical manual labor that you do next to other people, what are you doing with that? The resources, the gifts, your wisdom, your intelligence. What do you do with those things? Are you putting them into practice? Do we speak up and give room for those who have not been given a voice? Not that we're even a voice for them, but we welcome them to the table and we say, you have a voice. Are we showing hospitality to strangers, and do we walk with the poor and the needy? Do we relieve suffering when possible? Ultimately, are we living lives that reflect who God is? If you're here and you are a follower of Jesus, that is our responsibility. That the presence of God dwells in you and me, and the hope is that other people get a sense of that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but Romans 12, 9 through 17 is kind of this list. And as I was studying, I thought, this is kind of the anti-life of being a sloth. And so maybe you want to write these down. Maybe you want to highlight this in the Bible. Maybe you want to look at this over the next week. But here's how we reject apathy. Here's how we fight against indifference. Romans 12:9. Love must be sincere, hate what is evil, and cling to what is good. I don't know if you know that the Bible tells you to hate something. It does. Hate what is evil and cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Honor one another above ourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Another translation says, not slothful in business, but passionate in serving God. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with God's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. Rejoice with those who rejoice, and mourn with those who mourn. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil, but be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everybody. So as we leave, the two areas I want you to think about is in what way do you need to reject apathy and indifference in your relationship with God? Where have you become just indifferent in that relationship? And how can you fight against that? Whether it's in prayer or reading scriptures and worship. And reject apathy with our neighbors. So ourself with God and with one another. So be diligent in loving your spouse, your kids, your family. Be diligent in working for the peace and prosperity of your neighbors, of our community. Be diligent in fighting for justice and what is right. The sin of slothfulness leads to a slow but painful death of our heart and soul. But the hope is that we faithfully pursue Jesus. That we pursue Jesus in his ways, and doing so we'll put to death the sin of sloth, and we will begin to experience the abundant life that God gives us. Well, Greg's going to come up, and we're going to end with the song that we've been doing as a declaration, as a benediction, as a way of saying, this is what I want for my life. And so as he comes forward, I want to just give you a moment to kind of process through that. Is there an area in your life where you've just become indifferent? Where your silence is deafening to the people around you, whether your family, your neighbors, our community? What does that look like? What does it look like for your relationship with God and with the community? Would you stand and I'll pray, and then we'll end with this song. God, I'm thankful that it's you and you alone that gives us life. You give us life to the fullest. Would you help us? Would you help us to be honest? Would you help us to ask the difficult question where we're being indifferent, where we become apathetic, where we just simply don't care anymore? whether it's our own struggles or it's relationships or what's going on in our community or in our world. Would you help us to fight against that? Would you help us to embrace this idea that we can live out your teaching, that we really can love you and we can love our neighbors, and in doing so, that makes a difference. God, would you help us to make this true? I pray this in Jesus' name.